So now I want to welcome Dr. Scott Langenegger. He's an associate professor of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago, director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Center, and a leader of the University of Illinois Center on Depression and Resilience. I met Scott years ago while working with the bipolar research team at the University of Michigan Depression Center. I like to refer to him as a resilience mentor. Someone who has both insight and compassion in this field. I'm honored to have him here. Please join me in welcoming Scott. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for coming today. It's a great honor to be here. I feel privileged to be a voice for the fantastic art that's on display on the walls here. And I really want to take a moment to thank all the artists present and not present for contributing. Thank you so much. So what I'm hoping to do in the next half hour or so is to really stimulate discussion. I was talking to somebody in the back, and she said, "I'm really looking forward to listening to you today." And I said, "I'm really looking forward to learning today." And she said, "Well, you're going to teach us." She's sitting right back there. And I said, "No, actually, you're going to teach me." So I'm going to tell you some thoughts, things that I've learned over the last 45 years as I've circled around this sun of ours on this planet. And the take-home message is that I really don't know hardly anything at all about what it is to actually be successful and to survive and thrive in this world. And I learn every day new things that surprise me and thrill me. And I hope to share some of the things that I've learned thus far with you today, but also to hopefully spur some conversation and some thoughts for our panel after we begin. So the first thing I want to start out with as a theme, and many of you who have heard about the term resilience in the past have probably heard of this, and it's the idea of gratitude. Gratitude is a state of mind. It's a state of mind where we thank those of us who are present and who contributed to our well-being, even those who may not have actually contributed that well to our well-being. For being here. Each day is a gift and an opportunity, and I really do believe that. So resilience, actually one more credit. So the fun backstory behind this is I told my daughter, my older daughter Maya, who's now 16, that I was giving this talk here in Wyandotte and that it was about resilience, and she said, "Well, what's that?" And we had this conversation, which actually mimics some of the conversations that Stephanie and I have had in the past, about the difficulty people have had sort of wrapping their heads and their minds around this idea of what resilience is. And I think it has a lot to do with the idea that I think we've gotten it wrong. I think we've sort of looked to people who have done amazing things and have never failed, and we say that's resilience. And I would strongly encourage you to rethink that. I think some of the strongest and most resilient people are the people who have fallen, have gotten hurt, and have found a way to be strong enough to get back up again. So I thank Maya for helping me with this. Some of these slides she actually put into a presentation that she did at school last week. So we've sort of had a little team effort here. So resilience, the official definition, is the ability to resist, absorb, recover, or successfully adapt to adversity or change in conditions. And I want people to sort of really focus on the word of adapt, because in life, it's not really how awesome or wonderful you are. It's really more about how able you are to adapt to your environment and how willing you are to actually ask the people walking on this journey with you to assist you in adapting if you need it. I also want to emphasize this theme of "you are beautiful." It's one of those things you run across and you think, that is just so clever. And the basic idea is that beauty is not on the outside, the beauty is on the inside. And everybody is beautiful in their own way. So this is a very close mock-up. I found this on the web just a little bit back. It's actually a very close mock-up of the lovely picture that Stephanie took that actually is a part of our program here. And I found this quote, and this quote really sort of, I think, sticks with me for today. And that is the idea that perfect is not a goal. By definition, we human beings are imperfect. And so our goal is actually really to focus on being good or feeling good. So the idea that many people have, and this is sort of in the popular press, is that resilient people do amazing things. They climb to tops of mountains, they swim, the English Channel, they do all these incredible things. And that is true to some extent, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today is the fact that we can learn to become more resilient. We can learn to become more adaptive. We can do that through working with others in partnerships, both professional and personal. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the idea of compassion. But these are all things that we can learn. And of course, they're also things that we can forget in moments of hardship. So it's good to try and remember that we can come back to those. So the other myth that is commonly out there is that resilience is the same thing as being impervious, right? So impervious means that you're unaffected by those things around you. And I would also take issue with that myth. Being resilient means that you actually feel things as deeply or even more deeply than those around you and are affected by them, and yet you find the means to move forward and to strive to meet your goals. So one of the examples that I use is sort of this idea of strength. So the strongest person is not necessarily the most resilient person. And one of the old tired examples that people use, and it's always a good one, is to say, well, how heavy is this glass of water, right? A couple ounces, not terribly heavy. It's not actually the weight of the glass that matters. It's actually how long I intend to hold it. So when we think about strength, strength is actually one part the actual physical or emotional capacity, and another part of it is actually using your skills wisely. So I know that I don't need to hold this glass indefinitely. I can put it down, or I can hand it to somebody else. So this is actually an image from the Bataan Death March. And the reason why I pulled up this particular image is because it enhances this idea of partnerships. So what you can't see terribly well here, there are actually people who are on this march. It's I think a 45-mile march down the Bataan Peninsula of 20,000 soldiers, and 1,000 died in that journey. But these are actually soldiers who are walking in this death march, who their comrades fell next to them, and they created these little tourniquets, these little hammocks to actually carry their comrades with them. And so the idea is that it's not that I'm the strong person who's carrying my comrade, it's that sometimes I'm the person who's willing, when I fall down, to be carried for a bit. And the idea that you can hope and work together. This gentleman here is actually a person who survived the concentration camps in Japan. Those of you who have seen Unbroken probably know the story, right? So Louis Zamperini. And he endured tremendous hardship, and we think of him as being strong, but one of the quotes that is in the book that stuck with me the most is he said, if I had known at the beginning all that I had gone through, I'm not sure that I would have been strong enough to actually follow that path. And what does that mean? It means that sometimes strength is not being aware of the long-distance goal, but being aware of the immediate goal. The immediate goal is to survive to the next day sometimes. So this picture actually sort of, I don't mean to be in your way here, this picture sort of is interesting to me because you can actually find different elements of determination, or actually different elements of sort of positive and negative in this picture. And I think one of the comments that Stephanie made sort of illustrates this, which is the idea that I can look to the shadows, I can look to the weeds, or I can look to the beautifully built dollhouse or the sun. Our attentional focus, and we'll talk about that a little bit, is very important in our determination. And one of the things that when we talk about resilience I think is the hardest to understand is that we don't have resilience all the time. We don't have resilience every day. We don't have it every moment. There are times when we feel weak and we feel vulnerable, and that's when we need help, and it's okay to actually ask for and receive help, and that often is the hardest thing for people to do. So tomorrow offers opportunity and the unknown. So when I look at these two trees, they illustrate for me some of the cultural challenges we have in thinking about weakness. So one tree is beautiful, it's symmetrical, it's well balanced, and the other tree is not so well balanced. But yet, both of them are producing leaves. Both of those are surviving. And this one just seems to have been trimmed back so that the power lines could come through. And the reason why I bring up this in particular is because it highlights this idea that resilience is not about being symmetrical or balanced or being perfect. Resilience is really about the idea that we can be imperfect and we can persevere. So the acronym that I want you to walk away with today actually follows nicely from our program that the group here put together, which is Pathways or Paths. And it's planning, awareness, thinking, holding, and self-care. I'm going to go through each of these components one by one. And what I want people to sort of come away with today is this idea that resilience is not a judgment that's passed on somebody at the end of a game. You know, you can say at the end of a football game, well, they were resilient, they came back, or the end of a marathon, they stuck it out, they finished. Life doesn't quite work like that. Life works a little bit differently. We have a long path before us, and every step that we take is a new part of our journey, and we can't actually envision what's going to come next. So it's about being adaptive. It's not about being strong or impervious. And I'll keep on coming back to these sorts of themes. So planning, to be purposeful and deliberate in attending to current and immediate next steps. So what is actually right before me now? And this is actually one of the beautiful analogies I see in the artwork around us. In order to capture the beauty of nature and the beauty of resilience, you actually have to be right there in the moment, and you have to see the beauty of what's presented before you and capture it in your artwork. And I think that's such an important concept, as being in the now. So much of the time we spend thinking about someday, or I wish that hadn't happened. And those are places that are good to visit, but not good places to stay. The now is the place that we should be. So this is just another illustration of art that is inspiring to me, which is this idea of a journey. And of course you can see that there's an obstacle in the way on the path. Part of planning and being purposeful is not to worry about that log that's blocking the path a few yards down the pathway, but actually to worry about where my next step is going to go. So if I'm thinking about this big obstacle, I may actually stumble on a small obstacle in the immediate vicinity of where I am now. They're here again. If I'm looking towards the horizon and I'm thinking about I'm going to make it to the lake, I'm going to make it to the beach, I may actually miss the fact that there's a hole right in front of me that I'm going to step into. So being in the now, being in the present, and planning for right now as a pathway to the future is very important for resilience. Awareness is actually, to me, the hardest part. I struggle with this every day. In fact, we were just talking about meditation just a few moments ago. We get so caught up in where we're going and what we're doing that we forget to actually pay attention to how we feel or to our immediate needs of the moment. So when I get really busy and stuck in working on my science, sometimes I'll forget to eat, sometimes I'll forget to grab enough coffee, and then I'll get a little bit cranky. But being aware of what you can control, being aware that recovery is a process and that it takes time. And the hardest part, which we all know here, is what is actually realistic. So how do we actually be aware of what a realistic goal, both a short-term goal and a long-term goal, is in what we pursue and how we spend our time? And this is again a pathway, sort of illustrating our journey. And it's easy to think about, well, I want to get to the end, and not really be aware of, I want to experience the joy of what is now. Sometimes it's not joy, but in this case it was. It was a lovely day for a bike ride. So here's a slide that I borrowed from Dr. Angela Smith. And I think this is a theme that we're going to come back to again in this talk, which is this idea that we like to applaud people at moments and times when they have demonstrated growth and they've demonstrated success, they've demonstrated prowess in something. But there's a lot in the backstory, right? In the backstory, sometimes we're just treading water. And one of the funny analogies that I've learned in life is when I used to be a lifeguard, is when you get tired, what do? You don't tread water anymore. You do the dead man's float. How morbid is that? But it's incredibly effective. When we are struggling in the water and we feel like we're about to drown, sometimes it's okay to actually be in the moment and just survive to the next day. There's no shame in that. There's actually brilliance in that. And then when it's time, when you feel recovered and you have your partnerships together, including both personal and professional, you can move on to adapt and you can move on to recover. And then there may be growth that occurs as part of this process. And I think it's important to remember that it's not always about that time when you get the award and you've showed everybody else that you've been successful. We all know that there's a lot more to the backstory. And the backstory is where resilience lies. It's not in the award itself. So those of you who know me well know that I love sunsets and sunrises, and there's actually a couple in the art around here. And I think the beautiful thing about awareness in sunrises and sunset is there's that beautiful moment, especially in sunsets, when things move from amber to copper to violet to this deep shade of purple, and you're just mesmerized with the world. And my family makes fun of me because there's a certain thing that happens in my head when I start to see the shadows get long. I have this desire to go outside and experience and enjoy the sunset, and I'll find a place to just sort of be for a few moments. I don't know if that's part of what makes me resilient, but it certainly helps me be in the moment. And I think it's just so wonderful to be able to appreciate that in nature. So we're going to talk a little bit about reflections here in the concept of awareness. And the reason why I bring this up is because reflections to me illustrate sometimes that we get caught up with the surface. We get caught up with the things that are happening on the surface and not necessarily appreciating that there's much more beyond that. So why do I use this analogy is that I think sometimes we can get caught up in the superficial. I think we can get caught up in the past. And a lot of times when I work with patients in therapy and in my research, there's this sort of magnet. There's a magnet in the past that's pulling them back to an event that is traumatic, an event that has been deeply traumatizing to the individual. And part of the process of healing is knowing that that's a place that I visit, it's a place that I go to and I know well, but it's not a place that I can stay. It's not a healthy place to be. And I think that is part of what reflections and awareness means to me, is that you're not going to receive any food or succor or shelter or embrace in the past. That is in the present. Another illustration of reflections. The other thing that I wanted to illustrate there, and this has been to me the biggest learning opportunity in the last probably 10 years, and it sort of gets to this point that I made earlier about people teaching me. So I see an interaction between, say, a father and a daughter, or a mother and a son at a grocery store, and I start to think, oh, I wouldn't handle it that way. I can't believe a parent said something like that to their child. But I only am looking at the surface. I'm only looking at the moment. And a lot of times now, because I've learned, I will sort of find a place to quietly observe a little bit further away. And almost invariably, I see the natural resolution of that conflict in a really endearing and positive way. And it teaches me again and again that what I see immediately, what's on the surface, is something that I need to be aware of and to be careful of. So The reason why I put this picture up is that our eyes are naturally drawn to a focal point of an image, right? So in this case, the focal point of the image is the sun and the reflection of the sun on the water, but we miss the fishing rod. We catch it right a little bit later. We miss the baseball cap of someone and the hair of another person. We miss that there's actually a humpback whale jumping in the background. You can't even see it, but I know it's there because I was there and I saw it. So it's really, I think, important for us to be, part of being in the moment is slowing down sometimes and just sort of thinking about what's beyond the reflection. So when we think about awareness, we should also be aware of the fact that we are not alone in this world. None of us are amazing, awesome, independent by ourselves. We thrive when we are supported by those around us, when we are able to ask for help. And this is also something that I learn over and over and over again, is that I don't have to do it all myself. I can ask for help, and people will be willing to offer that, and they'll offer really good help, and oftentimes help better than what I could do on my own. Be aware that there's creativity in yourself. One of the things I hear often from patients that I work with is, oh, I just don't have any ideas, I'm not creative. And that's an internal narrative. We're going to talk about that internal narrative in just a little bit that is really damaging to creativity. When we think about creativity, it's not just about creating something beautiful and awesome or capturing it in the images that we see here. Creativity is actually finding novel solutions to old problems. People get tired of me saying that if you want things to be different, you have to do things differently. Too often we get stuck in the idea of, I want things to be different, I have to do it better. It's not about doing it better, it's about doing it differently. Finding a different path, finding a different way. It's part of the theme that we have in our talk today, is that sometimes the shortest point between the shortest distance between 2 points is not actually a straight line. If it was a straight line, then we wouldn't be here talking about resilience. We'd all get to where we needed to go easily. So when we find these, we recognize that we are, I use my own word, naive or ignorant or vulnerable, and recognizing that and being okay with it is part of being aware. So thinking, and this is what we as therapists spend a lot of time talking about, which is thinking. How do we actually reframe and treat the way we talk to ourselves, the way we think about our problems, in a way that is adaptive, without judging, and sort of thinking about how can we use setbacks and successes to learn from. This is the only brain image I'm going to show to you today, although I study brains in my work 95% of the time. One of the things that we've learned in the last few years to decades is that we had this idea of the brain being sort of like the hardware of a computer, right? So you have so many gigabytes of RAM, you have so many gigabytes in your hard drive, and you have so much speed in your processor. And what we've come to appreciate is actually the brain is so much more magical and powerful than that. The brain is adaptive, it's plastic. The brain, if I could use one of the quotes from our author, one of our photographers today, is not all brittle and glass. The brain is adaptive. The brain is resilient. We limit what the brain can do by our own construals of our limits. And so we can adapt and we can heal. That doesn't mean we're going to forget. That's a different process altogether. So this is the busiest slide I'm going to present to you today. And the reason why I present this slide, I just want to focus on the first, well, we can go through all of them. So this may be hard to see, so I'll just point out the things. So when we think about as individuals in our environment, we think about our environment, we see a stimulus. Stimulus could be something out in the environment, it could be something in our mind. Before we're even aware of it, our brain is making calculations about whether that's a thing that's good for us, whether that's a thing that's bad for us, and our brain is automatically thinking up contingencies. So the example that I use is if I'm walking down the hallway and somebody smiles at me, my brain is automatically thinking, oh, it's time to smile back, and I can do that in milliseconds without even thinking about it, right? likewise, if I see somebody walking down the hallway and they're frowning, my brain is also going to think about, okay, is that person angry? Are they going to strike out at me? Did they have a bad lunch? You know, whatever the potential contingencies might be. And what we do automatically when we are in periods of health is we have what's called a rose-colored glasses distortion of the world. We tend to view things that are positive as being things that we're kind of responsible for, and things that are negative as kind of things that the world is responsible for, or maybe other people are responsible for. And when we get into periods of depression or bipolar disorder, that natural rose-colored glass distortion actually becomes morose-colored. It sort of shades things towards the negative. So that person didn't smile at me, so that means that they're angry at me, when in fact they're probably just in their own moment thinking about something else entirely. But that distortion then can lead over time to a withdrawal from the environment, to withdrawal from those partnerships that keep us healthy, and can perseverate into a full-blown depressive episode. The other thing that I highlight here, and it's why it goes in the thinking part, is that we have a capacity to reappraise what is happening to us, how we're experiencing it, the way we're going to approach it at every moment of every day. And that doesn't mean that we're able to do that, but it's important to remember that we are capable of doing that. So the other part of thinking is recognizing that partnerships, both professional and personal, can aid in adapting and recovering. And there's a brilliant ad campaign that's being done right now by American Family Insurance. I don't know if you people have had the opportunity to hear the ad campaign. It's I didn't do it alone. So it's the person who climbed to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, person who sailed around the world. And they're talking about all these people who are present with them mentally, even though they're physically alone. They're keeping the idea of those people who have assisted them and are supporting them present in mind. That's incredibly powerful to think about the fact that when we walk on any journey, we are not walking alone. There are people there to support us and to empower us. So the other parts of resilience that I want to highlight in this slide here are mental aspects of resilience and emotional aspects. And I've sort of got these listed here. So it's really easy to get caught in what we call thinking traps. And thinking traps are sort of, this is the way it happened last time, this is the way it's going to happen this time, there's nothing I can do to make it happen any differently, I'm powerless to change things. And that's where I come back to the thing that I told you moments ago. If I want it to be different this time, I have to do things differently. I can't do the same things and just hope that it's going to turn out better, or I can't prepare more and do the same problem-solving strategy and hope that's going to be better. I have to actually do things differently. I also want to talk a little bit about impulse control and what I refer to as self-damaging behaviors. So a lot of times when people are feeling upset or hurt or alone, they may engage in behaviors that are detrimental in the long term and may be helpful actually in the short term. So one of the examples that's running rampant through our country right now is opiate addiction. Right? So opiate addiction is born from the fact that opiates are actually fairly helpful in adapting to emotional stress in the moment and pain. But they're incredibly addictive primarily for that exact reason, is that it doesn't force us to actually address the actual underlying problem. It's a shortcut. And anytime we take a shortcut towards some types of problem solving, we're going to run into that particular problem. And again, we come back to this idea of, can I control the controllables? And that is always the hardest part, because I admit it, there are times when I really want to control some of my in-laws better than I do. And then I have to let that go. And it's perfectly fine to let it go and to say, you know what? Let peace be peace. So this is the final concept that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today, and this idea of holding. And it's a strange term to use, but it's one that really sort of has stuck with me no matter how I've tried to replace it with other things. And if you look at this particular picture, you see the child embraced and held within the hand of another. And I want you to imagine that that child is actually you. And you are actually responsible for holding and cradling that child. Other people will help you with that, but you are the primary person who's responsible for treating yourself with respect and dignity. And this is the most fundamental part of resilience, and it's the part that when it breaks, it's really devastating to see, and it's devastating to the loved ones of the people who have to see it. Again, this idea that we can hold ourselves with compassion, we can hold ourselves as something that is sacred. Sacred. It's an amazing word to think about what that actually means. But human beings, every single one of us, are sacred. We are valuable, regardless of what we do, regardless of who we are. Hold that self as valuable. Be compassionate, be kind to yourself, as we were talking about before. That inner voice that you have and the way you talk to yourself. Be compassionate, be kind, even if you are being constructive. It's another idea of holding. This is an illustration of patterns of response to stress. And we sort of highlight this red line here of when stress happens, those people who return back to health most rapidly are the most resilient. And I want to disabuse you of that. I want you to look at this line, this black line, this chronic stress line. Those are the people who are most resilient. Those are the people who are most worthy of our praise and support because they are sustaining a battle against things that are very hard to battle. And mental illness is one of those things. So we posted this, actually, Stephanie and Al and I were trading pictures of tulips. And tulips offer a beautiful analogy to what resilience is. So in our culture, we tend to think of the flower when it's in bloom as being the epitome of beauty and power and resilience and strength. But that tulip waits through a long winter. That tulip waits through a rainy spring. And it has to endure a long, dry summer to get to that moment in April when it can be amazing and beautiful and wonderful. And I think that is more akin to what we can do as human beings, is that we don't have to be beautiful and amazing and brilliant every single moment of every day. We wait for the time when the conditions are right to bloom, to blossom. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over this one. So the last concept in self-care or striving, I sort of went back and forth between those two terms. The journey is a path. It is not more or less. It doesn't matter whether it's direct or efficient. It just is. So embrace the journey that you're on. Don't be afraid to acknowledge that it may not be linear. Mine certainly has never been linear. What does the cheetah in this image have in mind, right? The next immediate goal, lunch. Not worried about whether or not they're going to get promoted, not worried about whether or not they're going to get a job. They're worried about the next immediate goal. And I think that's really important when we think about striving and self-care, is what is a way to actually sustain myself through the next moment. So I'd like to actually finish here with talking about 3 stages of living. I cringe now when I hear the word thrive. And let me tell you why I cringe when I hear the word thrive. It's actually right back to that analogy when we were talking about tulips. Thriving is sort of a state of being, right? It's sort of like that person is thriving. We see somebody who's in the moment of bloom as a tulip, and we say that person is thriving. But that could have actually been 10 minutes ago that they actually weren't thriving at all. It could be 2 hours later that they're not thriving at all. Most of our time we spend actually living. And living means that we're in the moment, we're enjoying the things that are enjoyable, we're working on the things that require work, and we're upset by the things that actually are upsetting. But there's another part. There's another part where I think we can do a lot more to help each other, is when we see people just barely getting by and surviving. And that, to me, is the point where resilience matters most. And resilience we think of as an internal thing. It's actually not an internal thing. It's actually a family thing. It's a community thing. It's a professional thing. So when people are struggling and it's uncomfortable to actually be in the space with that person, that is when they need us most. And that is when it's hardest for us to be with them. I admit that that is not my favorite place to be when somebody's struggling and hurting. It's not my favorite place to be with them in the moment. It's very uncomfortable. But that is when they need me most. That is what resilience means, is that we work together and we assist each other. So this idea of thriving is great. We'll get our reward. We'll have our tulip and blossom. But remember, there are moments in time when people are just struggling to survive. And that's when they need us the most. So there's surviving. There's living. So back to our paths analogy. One other thing that I wanted to close with in the S is the idea of stability. So particularly with bipolar illness, but also in major depressive disorder, there's a cyclicity to it. There's periods of strength and wellness, sometimes maybe a little bit too much strength and wellness and vitality. And it's really hard to find that even keel. And that is where the partnerships are most important. It's actually, if you are in the position of being a caregiver, saying, okay, so what are my clues that my loved one is going too high or too low, or a coworker, and being candid and open with each other about, okay, I'm worried about you now. I think you're going too high. I think you're going too low. How can I help? Stability is something to strive for. It's not something we achieve. And I think it's you know, it always humbles me to think about the opportunities to assist that I miss on a regular basis. And I encourage you to, you know, to be kind to yourself in recognizing when you miss those opportunities, but also to take them when they're there. So, thank you so much for listening to me today. I'm going to close with a poem that I wrote with some help of Stephanie. So, resilience is a journey too. For each, a path that is unique, moving forward toward meaning, purpose, and stability. A core to being accepting, human. Each day of resilience and recovery passes time like a river. We find, we grasp people, practices, and thoughts that help. Cradling them gently within our mind's eye, holding close, cherishing as sacred. Thank you.